Hi, I'm Simon King. Now, this video is a really important one, actually, because it has lots of implications for your sense of well-being as a player. It has lots of implications for your daily workflow as a guitarist. And it's something which I think is not talked about very often, or at least not as often as it should be, and it's practicing. Now, sort of old established ways of thinking about practicing are kind of archaic, I think, and don't really sort of get to the nuts and bolts of how our minds work and how we learn. What we need to try and do is harness the way our brains learn, and that's quickly. Our brains learn very quickly. Okay, we learned when we were kids to never touch a hot plate on the oven in about a tenth of a second, and we learnt that very effectively, and we never repeated it again. We learnt to never do that. Okay, we learnt to do all manner of things in life very quickly, and that's the way that we can learn on the guitar as well. Now, I think a lot of people get into sort of a mold of thinking that hours equal results, and it's not necessarily the case. Obviously, like, there are exceptions. I think certain things require kind of repetition, and certain things do require kind of a little more focus. But there's ways and means. There's a very quick curve heading very steeply downwards that occurs in our kind of cognitive abilities after about 60 seconds. Our attention spans are quite small. So what we need to do with our practice routines is develop a system that keeps things brief but very focused. Okay, it's like a rip fast kind of workout, but for your sort of mind and for your technique. Now, one thing to say that's very important to make the point is that there's a big difference between practicing and playing. Now, I thoroughly recommend that people play for as long as they want to play, and if that's 5 or 6 hours a day, that's great. As long as you're having fun playing and you're enjoying yourself, then that's what you should do. But there's a big difference, and I'm going to sort of make that definition in the T's and C's at the start of this very clear, and that is that practice, and by practice I mean very highly focused, shorter periods of time where things are planned, and literally there can be a stopwatch going for this stuff. There's a big difference between that and playing. All right, practicing shouldn't be a long thing. Playing can't be as long and as short as you want. Like I said, if you want to sit on the sofa and play to stuff for hours and hours, brilliant, absolutely amazing. And that stuff will go in, but you're not going to be learning in the same way as really rigorous, highly focused practicing. Now, even focus requires practice and a method. Even concentration is something that requires it's a skill that sort of you can develop. So I'm going to sort of propose that we sort of think about our practice in terms of 4 main things, and here they are. So the first thing is scales and arpeggios. All right, yes, that's kind of predictable, I guess. These are the sort of nuts and bolts and the sort of the screwdrivers and the Allen keys that are in our toolbox to when it comes to music making. Because the primary thing here is that with practicing, as with a lot of things with playing musical instruments, we have to be goal orientated. And I think the best goal and the most likely goal to get people motivated to practice is making music. All right, and making music is a passion and a love for everyone. Okay, well, maybe not everyone, but certainly is for me. So if our goal is towards making music, it's not towards getting better. And making music, you get better. All right, it's like a quick way of getting better. You play the music that you really enjoy playing, and by the time you realise it, you're really good at stuff, and things have happened. Okay, so if you're like. So it's not just a case of arbitrarily picking scales and arpeggios, or picking any of these things at random. Okay, just saying like, well, this week I'm going to study D major because, well, I've heard that D major's the thing. Or like I'm going to practice this set of picking patterns. Whatever. So, or it can be anything. This set of picking patterns because such and such said this, that, and the other. That's not the way to do it, okay? Because you're not goal-orientated there. All you'll end up doing is, like, you'll have one tiny sort of micro set of skills, but they won't be helping you towards the ultimate goal, which is making music. So if you want to be playing a certain piece, or you want to learn a certain solo, or you want to play like a certain style, everything has to be oriented towards that. Okay, so let's just pick if you want to sort of learn, a Beatles tune, all right, then we extrapolate our practice segments from that. So for the scales and arpeggios, you take the key centers out of that. Okay, and those are the scales and those are the arpeggios that you take from the melody of Eleanor Rigby or Fool on the Hill or whatever Beatles tune you choose. So everything is oriented towards that musical goal. So there's always it's a carrot and stick element, but the carrot's big in that you'll learn things about one of your favorite pieces of music, at the end of the day. So you'll always have that motivation behind you. The same thing occurs, with jazz is exactly the same. Like, primarily I'm sort of teaching jazz here, so I'll kind of use that just because that's sort of, it's familiar ground for me. But like a jazz standard, for example, that's a good goal, like learning how to play the chords, learning how to play Stella by Starlight, for example. Now, there's a lot of things in there that you can pull off threads and extrapolate threads of practicing from. Okay, you can do swing feel, you can do chord vocabulary, you can do, scales and arpeggio, you can do styles of articulation, you can do a really heavy, full-on, intense kind of improv, or you can do a nice soft chordal thing. There's lots of things that you can extrapolate from that. So just off the top of my head, we've got 4 or 5 practice areas that we can focus on. And that's without even touching on improvising and chord-scale relationships and making melodies and all of that kind of stuff, which has its own kind of vast field of play in which you can play on. So, so my point is your practice should always be oriented towards the goal in mind. Now, so the first task for you would be to pick, this is a nice thing. It's like an Argos catalogue. You go through and pick, that's a really cool tune. I've always wanted to learn that. That's what we're going to learn. You pull that tune out, you extrapolate the scales from the melodies, you extrapolate the chords, and then you extrapolate the stylistic things as well. And then you can even do your sight reading practice from transcriptions as well. Okay, so you can do these main 4 segments of our practicing workflow just by picking one tune, and that they're never going to be a waste of time because they're always oriented towards that. So your practice, in inverted commas, is these these sort of common threads and these things that you've extrapolated from that piece. Your playing for the rest of the day can be that piece or whatever. It could be a piece that's got simple chords, and you can play through that and you can sort of do your noodle and all that kind of stuff. But your practice is a lot more focused, and every time you practice each day, you'll find that you're sort of adding complexity, adding either tempo, adding extra things, extra notes to the end of the scale, extra notes to the end of the arpeggio, another version of the chord vocabulary, another inversion, another sort of a voicing for that chord. And in your improvisations, you're being more focused. So you can it's traceable each time you do it. So you can set yourself targets in that sense. So I think it's really important to note that, just to reiterate that practicing should always be goal-oriented, okay? And the goal should always be music. It should never be anything else. If the goal is anything else but music, my feeling is that the progress will be slower. So if you're always knowing that you're heading towards something really cool, like standard, the sort of it's quite a good thing. Modern education these days is always is like pushing that, thing of, learning through play. It's a big thing at the moment because it's how kids learn the fastest. They learn through play, And if you're playing music, then it stands to reason that you're going to be learning faster. Okay, so with that in mind, let's just run a sort of hypothetical scenario for extrapolating a practice routine from a piece. So let's pick Stella by Starlight, for example. It's a standard that's it's played often, and it's very popular, and it's quite challenging in places, so it's a good place to start. But if you just want to play the melody or you just want to play the chords, it can be quite simple. So there's nothing sort of preventing anyone from there's no gateways here that are in the way, or roadblocks, as it were. So even when it comes to looking at chord vocabulary, we can look at the first 4 chords of E minor to A7 to C minor to F7. Now, a perfectly sort of reasonable way of extrapolating a 5-minute segment of practice for chord vocabulary would be to develop 3 voicings for each of those chords. Okay? Or you could start with 2, for example, and then A7. then C minor, then F7. Okay, and that has taken what, 30 seconds? So we figured out 3 different voicings, 2 to 3 different voicings for each of those chords in the first, is it 2 bars or 4 bars of, yeah, the first 4 bars of Stella by Starlight. Okay, now with the articulation side of things, there's lots of things we can do as well, even with chords. So we can actually use that chord, so we can work on fingerstyle, we can work on top voicing, you know, kind of arpeggioic type of stuff. And when it comes to improvisation, we can actually sort of draw things around the skeletons of those chords. And then we can work on articulating those notes. And then we can work on the scales and arpeggios around those chords. Etc., etc. So even though we are working on our scales and arpeggios and our chord vocabulary and stuff like that, and bits of our improvisation and sort of picking an articulation by association, we are sort of we're still sort of moving ourselves towards that piece. We're learning bits of that piece, but we're doing the scales and arpeggios as part of that, rather than just sitting down and going, right, I'm going to learn a load of arpeggios. It's like those are the arpeggios that are relevant to that piece of music. Now, even in those 4 bars, you've got dominant arpeggios and minor 7 arpeggios. You know, they're very useful. I mean, they'll sort of see you fit for improvising over, you know, lots of jazz stuff. There's structural things that are very useful and used a lot of the time. So, you know, it's like the analogy is kind of using, you know, hiding vegetables into certain types of food, so kids get their sort of 5 a day, but they don't have the sort of pain of eating broccoli and eating carrots and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, that's the sort of theory with this, is like you're hiding the good stuff behind music, which is always good. Yeah. And then from that, you can then move on to say, right, now we're going to do 4 voicings of those first 4 chords, or we can take the next 4 chords and work out 2 to 3 voicings of those. So rather than just kind of go... rather than work out stock voicings for all of that piece, you're working out 2 to 3 different versions of that. So wherever you end up, you're going to be at home and go and feel comfortable. So you know, this is the sort of useful side of that thing. But actually, the point to make here is the fact that you're not going to be spending any longer than 5 minutes per segment on these things, so they're never going to get boring, right? And they'll make a much bigger impact in terms of the way that they kind of render out into your playing, because you're never sort of forcing the issue. Like, that's the single worst thing you can do, is kind of force the issue and overplay, because it kind of ruins your love for the music and ruins your love for playing. So, you know, it's always really important to keep things fresh as possible, you know, and then that kind of serendipitous childlike type of thing that's so endearing with you know, all of the players that we love so much. You know, the way that they improvise, it's very kind of serendipitous and kind of, you know, there's a naivety and an innocence to great improvisers. You know, that's what we love about them, because they're fresh, and you know, these ideas are fresh. You know, the other thing to sort of talk about here is visualization is incredibly important, and it's important for you to visualize. And visualization is a sort of bad word for it, really. It's more kind of internalize and play things through in your mind's eye. So you're not actually using your fingers. So you're developing the cognitive side of things, and you're developing the melodies within your mind. And you're sort of, I mean, you know, it's been used in sport for years, for decades now, and it's because it's effective. You know, using these kind of methods, you know, like playing through standards and chords and pieces and solos and stuff like that, and scales and all kind of manner of things in your head while you're driving a car, while you're doing things, it's a sort of way of daydreaming, really. Daydreaming is a great thing to do anyway, so it's, a lot of, it's used in a pejorative sense, but actually it's a really good thing. And actually, like, visualizing, having, especially rhythmic stuff, working through things in your mind's eye is really important. And by the time you get to an instrument, you're absolutely dying to just play, to make those things into a reality. So, visualization is the thing that you can do for long periods of time, and that kind of supports the sort of short, focused practice things that we're talking about here. But even kind of like, let's pick another piece at random, kind of like an Oasis, Wonderwall, for example. Okay, so we've got 4 chords there. We've got E minor, G, D sus, and then A minor. So we know immediately we've got scales and arpeggios for all of those 4 chords. We've got 2 to 3 voicings for each of those chords that we can play elsewhere. And we've also got the articulation side of things as well. So articulation is a really important thing, which I'll get on to talk about in a second. But that's something that can be, we can actually it will cross-pollinate into some of the scales and articulation, and actually even strumming as well. So even pick that piece, use that. So if you're struggling for content, you don't need someone to go, here's a bunch of exercises. You can just go, where's my favourite piece? Let's have a look at that. Right, what are the chords? What are the melodies? Right, we're going to play the chords, and then we're going to play arpeggios and scales on those chords, and we're going to learn 3 or 4 different voicings of chords on all of those 4 chords. It doesn't matter if it's not in the style, because we're not going to actually be playing the piece here. We're just going to be kind of using that as a basis for generating practice material from. But it's always geared towards that piece which you've chosen. So there's something in it for you all the time. Etc., etc. So, and that actually, when it comes to arpeggios, and you can sort of continue these as high or low as you want. I mean, this is the thing. I'm not going to be sort of too arbitrary about saying you must do this, this, and this, because ultimately, giving you the tools to giving yourself the tools to kind of, make these things up yourself. You're going to become experts at self-diagnosis. So, if there's issues with your playing, for example, we can sort of get better at analysing those and then extrapolating practice routines that are going to help you solve those problems. Because all we're effectively doing is problem solving. If you have a particular problem playing a certain piece or playing over a certain set of changes, you can then extrapolate the chords, extrapolate the arpeggios from those things, and you're always working towards that thing. So the next sort of major chapter really is articulation, and that is whether you choose to sort of finger pick or use a plectrum. It's something that, again, I think not many people practice too much, but it's one of the few things that will give you huge amounts of confidence as a player if you know your articulation is working nicely and the notes that you're producing are solid and sound really nice. Sound is so important. So if you're picking, which we're going to talk about in a sec, is feeling centered and you're not kind of in a weird place and things aren't feeling strange, then you're going to produce lovely sounding notes and lovely sounding phrases, which will then feed back and make you feel better about the music you're playing. Okay, so it's a nice circular thing. So articulation really is a very important thing to focus on. So we'll start with just the basics, which is timing. And by timing, I don't mean, with a metronome timing. Again, we will get to that, don't worry. But I'm talking about in terms of timing with syncing your fretting hand with your picking. So you're picking at exactly the same point as when that finger hits the fretboard. That way you'll get a nice clean sound rather than... So if you're... So the way to do that is to not pick. Is to sort of hover your pick over, pick into the air. Okay, I'm not even picking, I'm nowhere near the strings. So, but what that does is that teaches your right hand exactly the point in which you can pick. And they can slowly add that pick. All you're looking to do is not to... You're just looking to help that string on its way. Use the energy from your hammer-ons. Another thing to sort of focus on really is this feeling that you get when your fingers hit the fretboard is a kinesthetic thing. It's an actual percussion of sorts. Okay? And when you have that in that hand and that hand, you've got two solid things and two sort of feelings, if you like, that you can try and sync together. Okay? You've got your pick here. And you've got your hammer on here. Really think about focusing in on that. This is a terrific thing to practice, you know, for a good sort of 60 seconds. Get those two things exactly at the same point together. And what you're doing here is establishing a synergy in a relationship between your picking hand and your fretting hand. Rather than it sounding like... This delay I've got on here isn't helping matters, sorry about that bit. Okay, so really useful. And then you can change that to alternate picking. And you work on your up pick as well. So you're not just kind of flailing around with this left hand, you're actually using it, you're creating a percussion of sorts. And that actual force is something you can link, you can use as a thread to join. And this is a really useful thing when you're learning melodies and learning scales. It's always good, no matter how well you think you know your major scales, it's always good to return to them with this kind of focus in mind of getting it sounding as beautiful as you can possibly get it sounding. And the other thing to note about your picking is get the pick angle exactly right. If you're too flat with the string, you get a slappy sound. If you're too angled, you get that kind of nasty sound. There's a point at which every pick has a sweet spot. You want to get over the string without it going. It just wants to be one. Dong. And in terms of positional play as well, I always like to have a sort of solid point of contact with the body of the guitar, so I always know. Even if there's no finger there, I've got my kind of palm, back end of my palm on the bridge there. So get that sort of nice angle, which is sort of about on the kind of 30 degrees off straight. That'll allow you good mobility with the pick and create that nice, rather than which is straight on and then that which is the 45, you've got this nice kind of sort of pingy type of noise. sportsmen and trainers always talk about tight levers. Okay, so don't have your fingers all over the place, and like create a nice compact thing that you've got going on here. Your basic ergonomics should be, you shouldn't have a cocked wrist at all, either way. If you find yourself with this sort of situation, it's bad news, all right? So you want to keep a straight wrist. Your fingers are the flexible thing, so they're the things that can create the angles for you. Okay, but keeping that wrist just on the straight and your hand kind of slightly further back like that, that's going to create a really strong, so the centre of gravity is always coming through the middle here. And if you imagine you're hanging off a cliff, then that's the strongest point. You wouldn't hang off a cliff like that, would you? Or like this, you'd hang like that. And that's the strongest point of contact. Okay, so that's where you're going to get most of your strength. Okay, nice and straight, and this will stop you developing conditions like tendonitis and all sorts of other stuff. And the same thing applies with this hand as well. Nice and straight, none of this stuff. Although Michelangelo looks really cool when he does that thing, but ideally you want to be in a straight position like this, and your rotation comes from a mixture of your wrist and your thumb joint. The aim is to get the velocity really similar across the board, unless you're aiming for accents. Just get that velocity nice and kind of similar, like a keyboard without any touch sensitivity on it. Okay, and like do doubles. Little kind of like blemishes there that I would that I noticed on mine, that I would then sort of focus in on, and then sort of try and so this is the kind of whole concept of being as focused as possible on all the tiny little details, because at the end of the day you know this is only going to be for 5 minutes, okay? So you're not going to be kind of blasting your brain for hours and hours with this stuff, because it can be quite boring and quite tedious, but you're going to be able to escape in 5 minutes time. Right? So that's the sort of thinking behind that. But these things will become a habit. It's that kind of little and often thing, drip feeding these things, like a trickle down sort of thing, which is really important with sort of feeding your kind of general workflow. Always thinking about left hand and landing those fingers. This is like your metronome, if you like, with stuff like that, not the right hand. So use that as your guide. Start with that, and then the pick. All the work is done with your left hand, getting that clean thing. It always lands straight behind the fret rather than in the middle here, because you'll get less buzz. So on and so forth. So with your articulation, a few things to sort of recap on. Get your picking angle right. That's the sort of primary source of the kind of the tone that you're going to be creating. Okay, so just on the 30 degrees off straight. Okay, and then concentrate and do these exercises where you're kind of trying to sync up your left hand hammer-ons and fretting hand with this picking hand here. Okay, and the other thing would be to try and aim to get all the velocities as similar as possible. Sort of like trying to aim for no accents. And then when it comes to putting accents on, you know that you've got a good sort of default stock kind of velocity as well. So those accents will come out stronger. So if you need to do swing, if you're doing solo work, or if you're doing kind of any sort of 16th note and things, your ghost notes are going to be kind of nice and compact. think your stock picking velocity should be around 65 to 70% of what the string's capable of coping with, and I mean that by 0 to 100, where the string's flapping around and making lots of extraneous noise. It should be around 70%, and then when you need to accent stuff, it's going to have a bigger impact. So that's articulation, and that's the recap for the articulation 5-minute segment of our practice workflow. So the other big one, really, and this is something that's it really does need to be five minutes, because it can be very, very boring, and that's sight reading. And I think there's sort of two main resources I use for sight reading practice, and actually, it really does need to be 5 minutes. I mean, as long as it's done regularly, it doesn't need to be longer than that at all. It's just one of those things that kind of needs topping up the relationship between the interface, our interface, which is our eyes, transferring that off the page through our eyes into our brain, into our kind of body, if you like, and then rendering out onto the guitar. It's a kind of chunky thing. So recognition, pattern recognition is really important. So becoming aware of the language that we're looking at, which is notation, that's a really important thing. So regular, short, little, and often. That's the sort of the mottos really for sight reading. And there's two resources that I use regularly for that, and that's folk rigs and jigs and reels, and Bach 2-part inventions. And you can read the top part. Okay, these are sort of, and actually trumpet duets as well, Bach trumpet duets, and they're very good. They'll be in the wrong key, they're in B flat. So, but it doesn't matter really. You're just looking at the notes, And actually, if you're only doing this for 5 minutes, so it's if you're doing it for longer than 5 minutes, it'd be really boring. But then by the time you come to sight read in a real sense, in real life, your brain is so used to seeing those things on such a regular basis that it becomes second nature. And it's one of those things that's an easy thing to kind of neglect, because it doesn't really, it's a difficult thing to get motivated for. But again, if you're playing towards a goal, if you're aiming to learn a certain type of music or a certain solo, and that, you can pick things around that are similar. So your sight reading can always be things that are similar in style. Like it could be it could be solos from a Beatles track, or it could be a section from a Charlie Parker song, or it could be a Van Halen solo of something like that. Something that's related to the goal that you've got in mind, and then you can pick out sight reading things from that. I mean, there's lots of things online now, free transcriptions, so there's really little excuse now in terms of just generating the content. So again, it takes a little bit of planning, but once you've got that stuff, once you've got that kind of thing in place, then it's easy to draw on that and kind of utilize that and bring it into your practice. That way you don't have to spend hours looking for stuff every time, and you can get this practice, in inverted commas, section out of your day really quickly. So just to recap, 20 minutes maximum per day, 5 minutes, and I literally mean put a stopwatch on that 5 minutes. So 5 minutes scales and arpeggios, oriented towards a tune or a style or a solo that you're learning. Extrapolate what those things are, what the key centers are, and then you can sort of practice your arpeggios and scales based on that piece of music. The picking and articulation, which I've outlined, and that is the three sort of main things: is your picking angle, your string timing, and then your velocity. And that's sort of working on those three things and being very honest with yourself about if you do hear discrepancies and that kind of thing, then you can stop and slow things down by 5 beats per minute until it's all right, and then you can sort of ramp the tempo up again. The sight reading we talked about, so using folk jigs, folk reels, Bach trumpet duets are usually really good because they're quite scalic, and that will get you reading in larger chunks. So you'll see 2 notes at a time, or you'll see 4 notes as one thing rather than 4 individual things. So that's kind of pattern recognition and chunking up. That will sort of help with that. And then 5 minutes of chord vocabulary. So that, again, that kind of can be goal orientated as well. So you take a piece, take a style, take a player that you really like, take a piece of music that you like, and then extrapolate the chords and use them, generate 2, 3, and 4 different voicings of each chord, and then just literally go through and play them as the form of the piece goes through, you can play 4 versions of each thing, and then you can actually play through with the piece with different inversions of those chords. Okay, and that will sort of get you, that will help with that relationship, that visual relationship with the fretboard. And then that's 20 minutes, and that's no time at all. That's like a third of the length of this video that we've just done now. You know, I think. We'll see. But so you know, that's done in no time at all, and then you can get back to doing what you love, which is playing music, you know, playing things that you love. So I hope that's been really helpful, and best of luck.